It's game time, boys. It is game time. Alright, welcome back to my top 50 favorite albums of the decade list. In this video, we're going to be going through number 25 all the way up to my top pick, so I hope you're all cuddled up and ready to hear some eccentric little descriptions about some of the most intense emotional experiences I've had with music in the past 10 years. At number 25 is the Seer by Swan. This record speaks from the mountain above humanity and delusionally believes it's evolved past it for how intimate it's gotten with its cruelty, to the point where it kisses its dirty feet. Its builds sound like they're parading towards hell with an excited fire in their eyes, but sometimes there are glitches to its determination, and you can see the extent of the distress in the pastures below. 93 Avenue Blues sounds like tormented farm animals with rounds of ammo coming from the other side, and the title track evokes a similar shrill abuse with its harmonica and bagpipe cries, but most of the rest of the record sounds totally invincible in detachment. The instrumentals are armor-plated and drive out to a wide area, yet still feel claustrophobic. It's like they're firmly fenced into a large pen, but Mother of the World scope is needle-thin, and it has such a brain and vision-twisting confusion. It sounds like an ice pick lobotomy, and it's one of a few tracks that cements you into repetition and bangs against your head without a single flinch. Avatar is another one. The record's bass lines are magnetic, they leech onto your skin throughout the rest of the spectacle, all of which is actually unrolled at the midway point for these brief battle hymns, The Daughter Brings the Water and A Song for a Warrior, and that track's female vocals feel squirmishly moist for the album they land on, like almost erotic. But for the most part, being an outside witness to this thing feels like something gouging into your stomach, taking it apart in chunks, and leaving you with the same woe you'd have after being thrown down a well. Next up is LP1 by FKA Twigs. This record uses all of these understated sound flakes and has them slip and slide through each other like a serpent, but enough of them stay upright and jagged to form a whole ornate Baroque castle, which makes sense since Twigs' whole persona on this record is that of a demonic seductress, like one that would wear 6-inch heels and a diamond crown, and the dog-eat-dog way that she approaches stealing this guy from her competition makes the whole fantasy exciting and burn potently. But ironically, she seems empowered in being the submissive one in their affair, which is why her vocals sound so naked and cracked, like they'd shatter instantly if you poked them. But the sound design on this thing is more like a futuristic lacquer. The instruments themselves can have a burnished strength, like the bass on Pendulum sounds like this stream of falling marbles or pins, then the ambiance is freakish, it's like wobbly, gurgling stomach acid, or on the complete opposite end of things, it can feel like it's embracing and pacifying a track, wrapping it in transparent film, or shooting through like ecstasy in the choruses, giving all the bits of texture lying out a rich, gratifying conclusion. And next up is Pomegranates by Nicholas Jar, which, no, I have not seen the movie that this scores, but it has all of the melodrama you would expect of one, with a clear gothic twist, like it sounds like everything is happening over a jet black backdrop. Its instrumental timbres have this exquisite charm and splendor, even when they crash with mad concussion, like on Fall Into Time, or do rhythmic magic tricks to become malformed little abstractions, like on Beasts of This Earth and The Fool and His Harem. The tracks are like ice sculptures, elegant but brittle and surrounded by dehydrated fog. Or your petrified breath in reaction to all the evil going down. Like Three Windows sounds like some kind of fucked scene where a cloaked figure extracts all the oxygen out of your lungs, taking its time, letting you feel the burn. Or these hands covered in dark sludge emerging to choke you or stretch your face apart. But Past the Time and Survival evoke more of a silent, eclipsed ache. They use these samples of crowds and commotion to suggest being out and about, but their primary instrumental loops slouch tiredly like they're winding down and hardening into steel. It feels like the extent of how absurd and senseless our lives are just hitting your chest without warning midday. But Divorce and Muse take that tragedy and romantically swoon over it. These are piano pieces that sound improvised from a divine ballroom floor after closing hours, and Filet à Deux puts you into a dizzy stupor as well. The one precious moment that feels like seizing power for yourself is Club Capital, but for the rest of its runtime, be prepared to fall victim to its harrowing witchcraft. Next up is One of Us is the Killer by the Dillinger Escape Plan. As you would expect, this record's instrumentation sounds sourced out of Decay. Its riffage drags you along cheese graters and razor blades and rips your skin off. Then there are these remote mathcore breakdowns that sound like greased wires that wriggle and ruffle out with a strange beauty. It flounders about frantically, but it sprints to the finish line in a greater rush than dissociation. It has laser-focused agility. It transitions with less hesitation. It's almost like the instrumentals represent one panic attack that you unapologetically let manifest itself as rage, the kind that regenerates its own power eternally and spreads through your body like a forest fire, especially with the frustrated alt-metal fist it incorporates, which simultaneously has the robustness of iron and the contamination of a gutter. And the lyrics almost imply that two vindictive people are actively chained into a relationship with each other, and I'd say their most vivid peak is When I Lost My Bet, where Puciato's looking at someone with contempt for their constant need to eat up these temporary pleasures, and the album's only fluidity is in the high-register, touchy vocal melodies and in the atmospheres of the title track and the threat posed by nuclear weapons, which evoke such unadulterated sorrow. They sound like the dark blue, stormy skies that would come right before a tsunami takes out the earth. And ultimately, being an outside witness to this record's mania gives me such unlikely fortitude and utter invincibility in my lowest points. Next up is Plunder and Misery by Clipping. Maybe this is lame, but I already kind of covered this in my There Existed an Addiction to Blood review like 6 months ago, so I'm not going to do that again here, but instead of very lamely telling you to just go watch that video, I will insert a clip here so you don't have to go out of your way to do that, and you can just know how I feel about the record. Plunder and Misery peeled things back to these ambient scapes that were either like puffing dust where granular tidbits of noise would hit you in the face, or had a thunderous buzz that felt pulled from automated machinery like engines revving, warning signs, and etc. And after these synthesized into a boiling darkness, a selection of spirituals were added, which insinuated desperation for help from a higher power, which made sense considering the album's setting was on a spaceship housing a slave in captivity. The story followed no clear timeline. It was like its ends were supposed to remain untied, but really what made its magic get under my skin was focusing on its grand in the clouds poeticism foremost, then lacing the fable in second. The vessel itself suggests suffocation in 21st century civilization. Diggs alludes directly to commonplace mental crises and life obstacles, and where his deadpan rapping darts off speedily, I picture he's trying not to be swallowed up by the dark smoke of humanity, just calling out for something, anything real to grasp onto. Delivery-wise, his cold shoulder to conventionality makes his presence scream creator over rapper. He has this drained cadence, but explores different movements, like falling into a mind-numbing fatigue, packing together tensity, or babbling sardonically. His voice is always a tool. Anywho, the protagonist within this story sinks into the haven of trying to wrap things away, to snarkily comment on it all from the outside. He relies on it to save his life, really, and it feels like an eerie hint towards Diggs's incentive and devotion. Next up is Sleep Well Beast by The National, which, first of all, in all of their music, Matt has so vividly developed this character of a romantic suit-and-tie businessman living in New York, and on this record it sounds like he's reached a point where all he wants to do is pensively watch cars go by out his apartment window and whip out this reposed balladry to let out what's actually in his heart about this professional facade, this stagnant prison his life's become, but mostly about how he's lost everything he had in love. This entire network of histories with people feels like it should add up to something, but all there is ineffectual stubs, just odds and ends. And that whole landfill actually collapses on top of him and covers him in blackness in the title track. But many of the other cuts do actively vegetate. They're pricked by plump electronic globes, which can get totally high-strung, like on Empire Line before the hook just wipes it all away and liberates it off into the sky like a missile. That's easily one of the most excruciating instrumental moments on this thing. But still, much of it also stays in an emotional hospice. Of course, Matt's lower vocal registers dunk you down and lock you next to them, but I think even in the scenes that are in the blunt middle of City Racket, more than any other National album, this captures a spiritual intimacy as private as backroads through a neighborhood. Like nobody else will be there as this fateful meeting between two broken lovers in the middle of the night. It feels like Matt's motive here is reopening boxes of past connections that he slams shut and exaggerating their stories as much as his brain can to truly process and send them off. He's firmly settling in that lonely home base everyone forms in their head post-disaster, staring at that stern mental wall rather than making any sudden movements. Next up is New Slaves by Zeus. To me, this record kind of feels like the same default background that you would see before being launched into the simulation and after leaving it, which I imagine as either these glowing fluorescent whites, just all of matter becoming these pillowy swooshes, or like those interference screens and pixelated ant races that analog TVs would default to like 20 years ago. Gentleman Amateur sounds like all of the world's feeble atoms being blown and re-randomized back to their state at the drawing board, or it's like everyone receiving the same blaring noise through their ears at once due to some severe glitch in the Matrix. Definitely also get this from Don't Touch Me and the title track. And the former sounds like pieces of a ship being barbarically chucked around and discarded, while the latter arranges animal screams strident as fingernails on a chalkboard to chafe against your skin. It's like the sister track to Acres of Skin, which is a safari death march where the metal shackles have a huge presence on the soundscape, and I imagine it stomping towards ceremonial execution of some sort, and masonry is the moment directly before it commences. It's silent as an underwater mine shaft, or the eye in a hurricane. Its shimmery crystal ringing feels totally deceiving, and Black Crown Ceremony 1 is like immediate inception into death. Its horn sounds like your spirit flurrying off, and being aware that figures are preparing your body for disposal as you can hear their muffled movements. Then Black Crown Ceremony 2 is like reincarnation. Its brisk sound quality and crowd samples feel like realizing that a new day comes for everyone, whether it's wanted or not, and this is happening endlessly throughout all of time. Next up is Atrocity Exhibition by Danny Brown. Having this record as context, it's hard not to see the hybrid and XXX and old as steps toward lethal drug abuse, whether Danny had confronted the fact or not. And it uses a strategy of telling then showing. It starts with thorough perspective on the situation in Rolling Stone and the title track, then it deadpanly illustrates these nights of near overdose, where every hour that passes comes as a surprise, and what could be assumed is recreational actually translates for how fatal it could be. You choke on the secondhand smoke, you see the lines of coke, and people passed out with needles in their arm. It's that graphic. Danny is straight trapped in a trench, far outside anyone's capacity to save, and much closer to derangement than the way out. The beats have the bullheaded rigor of post-punk, the low ends hit like grenades, pneumonia triggers anarchy by whipping down these chains, and Gold Dust and Ain't It Funny sound like blow dryers or wheezes wet with saliva coming straight at you. They have almost a circus-like facade, and plus Danny's topsy-turvy yelps sound like they come from a clown soaked in gasoline, and White Line straight sounds like a cartoon panther stalking its prey, about to pounce and shed blood. But things get more stern again and from the ground and hell for it. These are tastes from the ground while the sky is falling, but Danny looks up and acknowledges how overtly essential change is. They black out everything except him and saving all that he's built. Next up is Rival Dealer by Peril. This EP is devouring all the emotion in the world like it's cocaine. The tracks have a panoramic scope. They're structured like long, impulsive journeys where the melodies rush in and out. The title track sounds totally exasperated. It's streaked in a powder bitter as crushed up Advil, and it hurtles so recklessly, it eventually slams face first into capacity and deadlocks into these walls of static. The vocal snippets the project uses are deformed and smudged with smoke. It's like they're cut up movie footage that we never get the full plot of. It's cryptic. And it's like the open fractures have been set on fire because sparks constantly fly out of it. And for the last two tracks, the project starts to have a much warmer aroma. Hider sounds like total rebirth at the sight of the person you love's face illuminated by candlelight. It's a human affection you're capable of deep down, reigniting, coming back into fruition, and those pianos rain down like there's been a drought for thousands of years, and come down to us as sharp circuits spin the ground into a vortex, revealing this glittery wonderland hidden in the underworld. Next up is Depression Cherry by Beach House. This record is Bare Desire. It's the most disorienting hybrid of hell and ecstasy that exists nowhere else in nature, and once you let it in, it's locked there. And even when it drags you by your broken ankles, dumps you into a lake, and laughs as you sink lower and lower, that person's eyes, skin, and smile are the only thing you can engage with or comprehend living for. And 1037's drums tick like you're staring down an antique wall clock all the way through the night, and you can hear your heartbeat resounding as this person erases you more with every second. The sanded percussion and vintage instruments on this record feel like a musty wall is sternly suspended above all of its mellow, balmy pitter-patters. The hi-hats are like little incisions or nicks, and Bluebird is totally striped with them. The distorted guitars try to interject like lightning strikes, but they're always constrained under the pressure. On Beyond Love, they tremble and crack open and diffuse, but PPP is the one moment where everything does open up. Its arpeggio wraps around and embraces itself, and on this track, Victoria alternates between crooning and whispering under her breath, like she's an enchantress, looking through an illuminated crystal ball to see every place their relationship has been and will be over time. The record is an aimless drive through a private neighborhood with that person under a silky midnight, zoning out over how messed up everything is, how everyone inside those houses is tuned into their own respective misery, but how immortal you are with them. It's a story only you can tell, a self-inflicted war that people tend to stop pining for as life progresses. It might bring you alive like nothing else, but humans can't function unless they're dead. Next up is To Shrimp a Butterfly by Kendrick Lamar, whose perspective is really all you need to believe your drama is a tiny deal. The record's about his struggle to come to grips with the fact that the pressing issues in his life are now this balancing act with his ego and managing the press, when he became so accustomed to fighting more immediate battles in the hood, and he has no idea how to now teach masses of people and literally change the ubiquitous psychological approach to these problems that he's now more connected to than ever, since being in the music industry has deepened the extent to which he understands that racism plagues people of color from all walks of life in this country. And with a crowd behind him, it seems more like an unquestionable duty, even when internally he feels like he knows no more than his guys back home, and he should be right there with them. But the more he advances, the less room there is to turn back, so he's alien to both places. And it's just moving that a name as consequential as Kendrick fucking Lamar is messing with beats that are this ballsy. They do share DNA with what the godfathers of funk and soul originally contrived. They have weathered indentations in them like fossils. And while they are sterile and durable, they stay stimulating with all of these flabby oddities. And at times just the fleshly howl to its horns in the nude communicates more than enough. Like You is this druggy sea filled with buoyant, clattering jazz that all sounds like it's flocking around total peril. For Sale has a similar layout, but it sounds more like a sarcastic parody of itself. It's a point Temptation knocks him out, and birds fly above his head as he stands back up all dizzy. Complexion and How Much a Dollar Cost are more sweet-tempered and floral, and they show that he can deliver simple lessons with composure. But then The Blacker the Berry is compelling because he just zaps you despite all that to spit in the face of his oppressors and flaunt their greatest fears of him. And You is totally haywire as well, but instead it shows a mental low that Fame's brought him down to that's totally shaken his foundation and left him distraught. Then I and Mortal Man wander off track without apology to drill his mission statement into the ground one last time. Lecturing us on these issues remains his calling, so he'll always do the best he can with what he's been given, but ultimately we should put our focus and dependence elsewhere. Next up is Plowing into the Field of Love by Ice Age. This record is being a complete slave to attraction and kept in a constantly unsatisfied limbo, being forced to jump into situation that won't work after situation that won't work, thanks to your primal instinct, which disciplines you blindly as a distant parent would, as Glassy-Eyed, Dormant, and Veiled suggests, and runs you dry of identity like Forever suggests. Elias's vocals are yanked out to all of their natural whines. He sounds like he's drunkenly choking on his words, spilling his drink. The instrumentals sound like they're putting a leash around his neck and dragging him around, or they're like a game of tug of war where the rope is overextended, almost snaps, then slackens back out again and again. Cimmerian Shade is total discord. It's like the instruments are disagreeing with being put in the track. The bass lines on this record are grubby, like they're physically being wrenched or screwed into it, and the guitars flail their arms up helplessly. The Lord's Favorite sounds like a whole-ass extravaganza with a country flair, and Let It Vanish uses this parading percussion. It's like the record is suggesting that this torture is a comedic show for all to watch. And it has this terrestrial essence to it too. Like the imagery is pulled straight from naturally burning forces of nature, like storms, hunts, fires, and Against the Moon flushes everything out. Its horns, organs, and pianos are like rain runoff, and this track is Elias acknowledging that he's cornered, and the only thing left to do is surrender. Next up is Going Places by Yellow Swans, which is the first 10 in this list, and its soundscapes are like being dunked under boiling pots, and needles scrape finely through its surface. Opt Out creaks like a tire swing or a weather vane in the aftermath of a storm, plus there are these vaguely bird-like yops in it. Its drones are bleary and understated. They only offer the slightest hints of suspense or remorse, but the rest of the experience is like total indifference. It's falling under anesthesia or into slumber and finding empowerment within that, making unlikely peace with the unforgiving hell that is mortality, and somehow for 1 second being able to let go of trite human cravings that you've been trained to let consume you. Limited Space may be the one exception where your end fate does hit like a truck. It uses these microscopic bells and panning thumps and propeller plane clicks to lug you into an automated, excruciating prison. Then this barking noise blasts in from the other direction to abduct it. And tracks move in single assemblies toward their crescendos, which get steeper than physics allows. It feels like the ground is just bending, or there are these rocks in your ribcage that just keep growing bigger and bigger until they eventually break it open. But regardless, everything is graphically chewed up in the compression. Next up is Immunity by John Hopkins. The whole first half of this record sounds like the sky is revolving into this cataclysmic tornado. The piano specs on Formed by Firelight and We Disappear tiptoe it directly towards apocalypse, even when their presence is timid between the fissures of these ruthless scuffs that corkscrew around themselves. All the record's techno infrastructure collides like tectonic plates, and Open Eye Signal is fixed into this hefty expansion and contraction. It's like a claw is clenching then releasing it. And Collider too, but that track reaches an apex where these synths that start from opposite corners of the room charge into each other face first, then break off in the opposite direction. They're like bodies in a mosh pit. But then you have a moment like on Breathe This Air where right as the bass starts to kick in like a booming cannon, all time just skids to a halt, totally unannounced. Or it's like the track wasn't looking where it was going and just fell off the edge of a cliff, and now it's spiraling powerless through the haze, and the question of what would have been burns in the deafening silence. And if not actively apocalyptic, the record sounds devastated. It's like a site of archaeological remains with sundials and calendars and attempts at measuring the Earth's natural processes scattered everywhere. And the last two tracks are these unconcerned strolls that sound fully cognizant that the fight is over, but somehow at ease with it. They're restorative as bathwater and remedial as a healing salve. Sun Harmonics uses these tingly shakes, then has a whole ensemble of angels fall down from the pearly gates of heaven to carry you off. And the last track sounds like it's in the same room as and uncomfortably close to all of this movement of thick-bodied furniture. The door hinge creaks as people pass in and out. It's like they're disposing of all of the record's remains, preparing it for entombment. Next up is Kaput by Destroyer. This record's instrumentals hardcore worship 80s Vogue. They're anachronistic, but they're legitimately utopic. They use these gel-coated opulent synths, these crushed-up glamorous guitars and urbane saxes, and on the title track, Behar acknowledges that if he's wrapped around the finger of the music industry, and it's surrounded by all this pompous journalism, this substance abuse, these aloof exteriors, and desperation for prestige, he may as well romanticize all of that, see it through starry eyes rather than let it leave a sour taste in his mouth, because this is about as good as life gets. You could see it as schmaltzy or melodramatic, but it's rooted in authentic attachment, and it feels like even though he's reached veteran status of scene after scene over the years, every time he approaches burnout, a spark of passion seems to just materialize from thin air, and they feel more and more urgent every time. And his lyricism is just like enigmatic decor, but it's better for it. It has this studious facade, but the deeper you read into it, the better you can see the mishmash of emotions tucked into it. It's like a romantic era painting or a tragic opera. And the production isn't total glitz either. It's wandering a windy village or harbor in the dead middle of winter, lying atop snow-covered outstretches of land. Suicide Demo is dehydrated by these chalky drafts and a woodwind, but all this garnish still shimmers beneath it. And Bay of Pigs' reversed landscape feels like the moments shortly before passing out, where all these artsy motifs start to blur into a nauseous panic. It's like Behar is acknowledging that beneath all this quixotic self-delusion, he's kind of a drunken mess. Next up is House of Balloons by The Weeknd. Holistically, Trilogy sets up the scene of an extravagant hotel party in New York, full of drama as shallow as you'd find in a soap opera or in junior high, but this record makes all of that fall into the background. It's upstairs, where room after room is infested in sweat or smoke, and the ambiance stirs it into a transparent solvent. It's a little out of focus, but you can see the skin color, and the whites from the rustling sheets and the cocaine through it, and the synths have a light glimmer on their outside edges, like honey, like raindrops, like rhinestones. Abel sensationalizes nightlife enough on this project to come across like he has no actual experience with it, but since he's overly fixated on some badass girl whose whole life is this and has complete tunnel vision on the sex that is technically within his reach, he decides to step into her world even though he can't handle it. It's like throwing his heart into a pit of lions and just hoping for the best, and then he becomes totally addicted to these extremes that he can't find anywhere else, and solely lets the fact that she is emotionally unavailable arouse him. It's the way that doing something you shouldn't gets your blood pumping, and the instruments can have a treacherous clang, like on House of Balloons' Glass Table Girls, where it sounds like a bunch of champagne glasses are being broken into a box, and the raspy bass drills itself in there. But there are moments that sound like everything played out exactly the way Abel wanted them to. Like loft music to me has always felt like a blissful type of morning after. It's the way the light hits the buildings once you get back outside, the way that life looks far more livable after touching someone. Next up is Animated Violence Mild by Blank Mass. You know the drill, just covered this a couple months ago, but here is a clip of me doing so. This record makes you feel delirious with power. It's like you're invincible, the decider of our universal fate. It's more strung up in the temper of its hooks than World Eater. Progressions stay pretty minute and intricate so that the main neon flash can beat you to a greater pulp. This thing is breaking past the breaking point. It's being on fire and then someone dumping more gasoline over your head. And sudden movements like the synths that knock you upside the head on House vs. House would legit only pass as natural next steps for a record that's already so indulged in lunacy. Not only that, the record is contextual genius. It's like all of these elements shapeshift once they're surrounded by everything else. The cheap electropop synths and stadium anthem hooks start to have this devilish smile and tease you with a, "Hey, what's wrong? Aren't you having fun?" And the singing on House vs. House and Hush Money has much more of a liquidy whine once you're so used to charged screams. They sound nauseous by the record's fever and have this hot breath on your skin. The noise should be coarse to the touch, but zooming out a bit, it can seem wispy as powder or elastic as taffy, and it all moves violently like a food processor propelling away underneath everything. And up flies excess bits with all these different edges, some rugged as broken glass, some fixed as a stick, some fine as a dentist instrument. See the start of Love is a Parasite, which later on tosses everything together in the hook like knives in a hibachi grill, and it's orgasmic. Last example I've got is the record's bite making any silkier melodies sound like straight dipping your head into the pool in the summertime. Best example I've got is Creature West Fuqua, which halts all the record's riots in this static, seared texture that slowly unravels into these harps, and it feels like this gentle sunlight was just waiting patiently underneath the record the whole time. It's so relieving. This record is mad. It's up its own ass, but that's its greatest strength. It takes the most unlikely hodgepodge of sounds and makes them get along just fine, like a fucking marriage counselor would. It's the most life-affirming rush, and it'll leave bloody fingerprints on the wall before it leaves. Alright, next up is My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy by Kanye West. This record is essentially the stimulation of human achievement. Ye here imagining himself emperor of this decadent Candyland shows where a backbone and the right dose of work ethic can land you. And he suggests that fame is this constant sensory high, like all of the lights' silky percussion just launches it into this frantic boulevard chase on top of a limo, where the blue, red, and green lights blur as he zooms past street after street. And Devil in a New Dress involves some consort with equal hunger to eat life sass as him, and an ego that could contest his own. And even when all that's ultimately going on is these petty little altercations, the track hits like this legendary exploit post-Nightfall. And the punchlines flaunt every amusing and eye-rolling idiosyncrasy of Kanye fucking West alike. The bitch-ass pouting on Blame Game and all-out pity party for himself on Runaway could only come from this type of dude, who could wink at you, and you'd either be a sucker for it, or want to strangle him, or both. And it basically sends the message that you can pimp your recognizable vices alongside your strengths on your throne, so they shouldn't necessarily hinder ambition. But it's even more badass when he uses his success to piss in the face of white America after they've thrown so many knives at his back on Gorgeous. The production uses right pianos and strings and elements that are as ravenous as a hellhound roar, like distorted guitars, muffled vocal effects, and touches like the samples on Monster. Those indecipherable grunts feel like strips of beef being thrown at you. And because most of the record is totally blinded by the rush, the moments where Ye actually fights with his vanity hit that much harder. Like Bon Iver sings out Monster and suggests Rabid Overdrive actually tipping him over the edge, and on Power it all builds up to the point he deliberately catapults himself out the window, also suggesting by means of this figurative death that it's the only worthy opponent he'll ever have. And next up is World Eater by Blank Mass, which I've already established that the wrath of animated violence mild is pretty constant, but World Eater shows all the peaks and valleys that it went through on its journey up there. And even its most boisterous moments don't feel so much like being inside an inflated circus as they do on that record. They're more stone-faced, like they're being conducted by a total buzzkill of a person who just wants to watch the world burn and has this cunning artistic dominance. And its eruptions are like baking soda volcanoes or more dangerous chemical reactions involving bleach or sulfuric acid. Many moments have the consistency of dust, like the ritualistic choirs that signal sacrifice or stampede at the kickoff of Silent Treatment. That dryness is covered by aqueous synth mounds on Please. Hivemind dribbles around in circles for a while until it's blown out by these belted screams, frozen into such passion they lift the ground plane up and tilt it. And these two tracks are vital for how they're the only ones with tangible, mutated souls. But then Hivemind also dices up these vocals into stumps, then lays them over top and they look like rigid crosshatch fences. The record does use all of these brambly munches, and they're the most severely penetrative on the Rat, yet it consistently manages to feel like being lifted and flung from cloud to cloud like you're a volleyball. It moves swiftly and without flinch, like an erratically angled light installation, and Cotton Candy Vape is always lightly puffing out of its wake. Next up is Public Strain by Women. The instruments on this record trudge and clink like factory appliances, plus they squeak like lubricated steel on china steps. Bells and Penal Colony are set in the dead air of a cavern or the sketchy basement of some apartment building. They use an organ to strand you there and shut off all time and thought, prompt as a light switch, just like clockwork. Plus, Venice Lockjaw sounds like it has to slog through a lump of muted quicksand. The record's arrangements sometimes distribute tension in unlikely ways, like Narrow with a Hall uses this flux of feedback that trembles as it unfurls and pulls away from the tightly clenched guitar cycles beneath it. And Can't You See has a very similar layout, but instead it uses fang-sharp, ramshackle noise and strings. And a lot of the record's weight inevitably falls on its bass lines and guitar work. Since the vocals and atmospheres feel so scraggly, they have the consistency of wilted elderly skin, or skin that's gotten pruny in a tub. Plus, they kind of feel like the first noticeable nip of autumn air, and distant town carolers wash out of Penal Colony for a few brief moments. Ultimately, they suggest all feeling within you withering away. But where necessary, the record willfully pushes on with its bare skeletons. Like, Eyesore's progression alone makes the whole thing seem oddly accepting and willing to climb towards somewhere better. And the guitars can even have a twinkle, and they sprout all over Heat Distraction and totally invade it. Same with Locust Valley, and that track's chorus flies it forward in a blur. So, while this album's emotions are dulled, there are traces of daylight to it, whether you stare at the surface of each instrument to find it or not, and it sounds like they gleam over mounds of snow. I always picture this scene being by the porch at my parents' house, which sits deep through these winding back roads surrounded by fields and forestry, and despite the fact that every year I'm back there, I'm more numb, there's more loss to deal with, and I'm sure as hell more alien to them, I'm also living more honestly, and that's exactly what this record is to me. Next up is There Is Love in You by Fortet. For this being Micro House, it feels exceptionally natural and hand-spun. It's full of taps and twirls from guitars and harps and xylophones. The reverse sound play on Love Cry and reversing makes your whole field of vision spin and your eyes fall to the back of your head, and lucid ringing is everywhere on this record, whether it forms these soft jingles like coins in your pocket, or whether it stays a flat coat, like the way it slips under the hesitating dance of Sing to even its temper out. And the only other loop that stumbles on this thing is the severed vocals on Angel Echoes. The sprawling progressions to these tracks makes it seem like Kieran had grooves sealed inside flower buds, and he let their petals overlap as they blossomed. Some parts are tightly clutched, while others shake and fall out with a sigh like they're on their deathbed. The record is surrendering all control to the universe because you have no choice. It's the moments immediately following catastrophe, before your world's been able to turn over, before all your bridges have erupted into flames, where time just stands still. It opens your airways to breathe and gives you the space to reflect on how sad everything is, and ultimately there's no greater solace in anything. And the record's uniform, nonchalant mix means every single loop has to shine for exactly what it is, and they all have such unassuming beauty and prowess. It's the stone sculpture of a ballerina mid-jump. Next up is Who Told You to Think by Milo. As some of you might know, this is kind of a big deal for me. Milo sounds like he's spewing out all of his internal monologue at any given moment, or writing a single journal entry on this thing. It sprouts equal parts flowers and weeds, and it's a tool for de-stress, so he's meditating contently in the tall-grassed meadow that it eventually forms. It roams without care, there are interludes and remnants and sudden ends dispersed everywhere, and all the sentences together form this amorphous web with acutely angled openings that are so eye-catching, you wouldn't want to mess with it. You gotta just let it hang for what it is. The record's production uses these ambient wormholes that have an incandescent mystical glow that sound like it's casting spells. Then it tucks scintillating jazz in, like watery keys and horns, and the earthly plucks on Ornette Swan Song and Paging Mr. Bill Nunn, which are more grounded to earth. And since Milo's so intently exercised his brain in the past and dug out references from rabbit holes scattered throughout the world, even what falls out by second nature is brimming with those. And sometimes he'll lump words together in ways that make sentences look blocky, sometimes they don't add all the way up, sometimes he'll get distracted and deviate from the point, but that plain language and dumb humor helps pad it out. And while it is cultivated too, the thing is, the philosophical parts have far more immediate relevance to him than you would find reading theory in a classroom. He's more just clumsily piling together existential thoughts, trying to understand how he ended up working an unsustainable number of hours every day, and watching critical parts of his life and sanity die, and how he apparently fumbled through every wrong backroad once he was let off on his own and ended up so stiffly settled on the outskirts of society, and how blackness in this country means peril over far greater risk of incarceration and police brutality. And side by side with Milo's other output, you could characterize this by how realistic and cynical it is, how down to business it gets about the disadvantages of being a poet. There's no empowerment in it, it's this innate burden on him. But as he grows and loss makes him more and more faceless, it seems like the only thing he can do, and he has a license to all the space in the world to create, which is what the interlude I Don't Know is to me. This record is just you and the universe. And next up is So the Flies Don't Come, which is more about seeing all the metaphysics occupying his mind as a total reverie, a haven, a means of sheltering himself. By his standards, this is more linguistically pinpoint and on the nose to specific topics, but it still captures openness and flies through space and ambiguity, and it's on the periphery of disconnection. and many of the lyrics are about how his time in LA made all of his divergence from social norms that much more blatant, but also pushed him to continue growing in that direction undaunted and find all inevitable condescension nothing more than amusing. So the lyrics bask in geekiness as much as they can and tend to do so impromptu. It's like how napping under the echo tree peaks in urgency, then he slips in, "I wasted my life microwaving jalapeno poppers," and somehow it fits. It's like how I feel watching a Rick the Live video, just reassured that I could say literally anything and spin it to work. It's freedom. The record makes rapping feel like spiritual recharge, like the aura of a pale-hued bedroom in the early hours of the night when you're in your PJs. It's Milo knowing if he bolts his brain into a state of concentration, he can take this thing anywhere in the cosmos. He's an alchemist. It's resolute love for labor, for bulldozing through the uncomfort to be released by fulfillment, and he sustains the inmost bond with his original reason for doing it, one that's as close as it needs to be to keep the machine running. On an encyclopedia, that's gripping onto his artistic left hook to shoot down white people's need to pigeonhole art made by people of color. On Reagan, that's looking fondly at the person who galvanized this sea change in his brain in the first place, noticing so animately all that he manages to make happen day to day, and understanding that now he directly mentors him too, and letting it all blow his mind. But he also acknowledges the ever-present impediments that come with creating, like the disconnect between all you want to make happen and what you actually can, and what you do only ever seems 2/3 of the way there, and the production stages ending up more rickety than you would expect, and you're simultaneously losing so much life and time. How can you be sure this is right? So the production's hot-cold flashes make a lot of sense. Like Going No Place has an even draft of strings that's nippy and glum, but then the detuned plucked instruments feel much more sultry and clammy. But the keys and mallets are fresher and more revitalizing. They're like glassware or wind chimes as you're walking through a seaside neighborhood. And Napping Under the Echo Tree feels like the record's precious moment of hunger to be more. Those plump, beastly vocals grab you by your shirt through all of your vacancy, and its fluent rings feel like being surrounded by an incantation in a magic forest. Next up is Frozen Niagara Falls by Prurient, which feels like your body being slaughtered by chainsaws, then your mangled remains being deep fried and made brittle. Sometimes those are joined into clusters, which the two title tracks just bluntly purge, while traditional Snowfall stomps into one in this ceaseless tantrum and leaves a total mess. And Dragonflies to Sew You Up's rhythm is similar, but it has enough concussion to feel like elevators falling on your head. And Greenpoint's percussion is thinner, it's like lids of tin cans slicing through your sides. And the record's high frequencies feel like they're coming from a traumatized interface that's given out. And on Myth of Building Bridges, Dominic takes a handful of those fragile sticks and wires and actual melodic form and tosses it all up into this shoddy tower. Pieces are falling left and right, it could collapse at any second, but at the same time it feels like this mighty, tormented power seizure that subjugates you. And the synths kind of remind me of the frenetic beads on Every Relationship Earthrise, which race forward, but they all trip and pile on top of each other into mounds. And on Sorrow with a Braid, everything is consolidated way too densely. It sounds like the track is in the process of being choked to death and turning purple, or its neck is being wrung out and all the saliva is falling out. But what makes the record gratifying, what makes it feel like the exact crossroad between numbness and the pinnacle of anguish that led you there, is its fluidity. It's like the ink drips falling off of these intricate barbed wire cages and spiked thorn bushes. It uses synthetics that have the consistency of a gel pack, or could be in a half-frozen pond where leaves and grime and ice chunks still float around at the surface, and the fat drones on gesture and agony totally devour you and leave you anesthetized, and I imagine this is how it would feel to escape to a totally remote, snow-covered wilderness where the only thing you can see is a perfectly clear, light gray sky stretching endlessly into the distance, and to know you're far from society and can give all the cold that's built up in your heart a safe place to exist and to clutch it there. But then again, the synth build on Shoulders of Summerstones sounds like the wolves you didn't know populated the area are on the hunt. And the ripple effect on the spoken word in this track and in Cocaine Daughter feels like stones being skipped into water. It slows your brain's reaction time and stretches your sight up and down, side to side. Then Greenpoint is drowning in the slimy deep sea, then your body coalescing and shriveling up with algae and jellyfish and seaweed. And I would feel like I was missing something if I didn't mention that Dominic made this in the aftermath of his wife of 5 years leaving him because he wouldn't have kids. Something so human. The record is the apathy from the exact person you would never expect it from, changing how you see everything and leaving you unrecognizable. And Christ Among the Broken Glass is the last crepitating lament to all that. It burns a body or a cross in front of a church door as black crows pass overhead. And next up, we're all the way up to the big one, my favorite album of the decade, which shouldn't really come as a surprise at this point, to those of you who follow me anyway. It is American Gangster Acapella by Jay-Z. I'm just being a silly bitch. It's Replica by One Tricks Point Never. Records suggest it's alive, but an unclassified being in its earliest stages of development that looks like this mutating black sludge that's here against its will and squirming around as it fights to go back. Sleep Dealer and Power of Persuasion leave their samples at the bone and let them fall out in a row. They look like these ornate, crackly edged sculptures on the brink of shattering. Or, since they come in from completely different directions and sources, these grotesque scrapbooks. Then Andro, Remember, and Submersible are suffocated in blackened ambient steam. They offer you to the gods as sacrifice, as shadows of bodies plummet towards their death in slow motion all around you. On Remember, that's initiated with a flare of a match lighting incense, making a glow orange as dawn reflect out of the landscape, and almost suggests the release and surrender, in being taken away. And the title track is this morose piano lullaby from an empty auditorium that uses a parched organ and hissing electrical noise and evaporates all of the world as exhaust smoke. Then Explain is like rising up to a sweet, dewy, primordial morning in another dimension, surrounded by creatures in their beginning stages of life, squealing like bugs. And I'll never know a record that makes me feel more invincible. So yeah, that's the entirety of my decade end list. Thank you so much for watching the whole thing, and I'll see you in the next review.